last month, the federal government announced its 2030 emissions reduction plan. And there's a provision in there that concerns electricity, the growth of generation, and decarbonizing the remaining power generation. So I'm going to talk to Dr. Bruce Lourie about that. He's the president of the Ivey Foundation, an adjunct professor of the School of Public Policy at Queen's University. So welcome to the interview, Bruce.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here.
Well, this is a really interesting document because I've interviewed experts who have modeled what Canada's electricity requirements are going to be in 2050. They say we're going to need 2 or 3 times what we currently generate, which means we're going to have to build more generation, more infrastructure, more transmission, more distribution. And the government's plan seems to acknowledge that. It says that we're going to have to both grow generation and decarbonize what we have left. But is the plan that's put in place, is it enough?
Yeah, well, I don't think we quite have a plan yet. I guess that would be my response. I think there is a recognition of the need for a plan. I think there are some early signals that the government gets that we probably need to plan, i.e. in the form of the creation of a Pan-Canadian Grid Council. And maybe most promising is what we're starting to see are, groups forming the Electricity Alliance, Electrify Canada, Canada Grid. So organizations of different subsets of industry in the electricity industry kind of self-organizing around the need for basically, more than a plan, but, a bigger plan, a vision, and some specifics in terms of how we get there, and there being, net 2050 and meeting our 2030 climate targets.
How important is the industry organizing to this? Because I mean, a lot of what goes on in law, what winds up in policy often starts as, it's being lobbied for by one industry or another or different interest groups. And I wasn't aware that the industry was organizing like that. So how important is that to this process of expanding our, electricity grid?
Yeah, I think it's critical. And of course, electricity is a little unusual compared to most other industries in that most of electricity in Canada is, a subset of government policy, right? So maybe with the exception of Alberta, where it's largely deregulated and private, most of the rest of the country is either fully public electricity provision or some hybrid, as in, say, Ontario and parts of the Maritimes. So this is really a perfect case where you actually have to have the private sector working in coordination with governments, and not just the federal government, but the provincial governments are fundamentally the most crucial in all of this. And so my hope is that the Pan-Canadian Grid Council would be a way for the federal government to kind of set the table so that we can have these conversations about what, frankly, is a monumental task of doubling or tripling our electricity system by 2050 while decarbonizing the remaining, carbon-based electricity. So, we can't underestimate how significant that is. And ultimately, we need the businesses at the table that are going to be actually building that infrastructure.
Well, when the Pan-Canadian Grid Council was being discussed, and then after it was announced, I was expecting something a little more robust, to be frank. I thought that the federal government would play more of a leadership role here. But the signals coming out of Ottawa so far is that the Grid Council will be more of an advisory role, providing information, and maybe, I suppose, facilitating conversation. Is that enough, given the scale of the task and the always prickly job of trying to get provinces to cooperate with the federal government?
Yeah, in this case, I think it is important for the federal government to be playing that convening role because, at the end of the day, they have very little jurisdiction over electricity. And I think if they play too much of a strong leadership role, it'll alienate some of the provinces who need to be at the table. So typically, as you know me, Markham, I'd be all for some strong federal leadership. But in this case, I actually think it's smart for the federal government to take a bit of a back seat. Um, as I said, set the table, maybe order the donuts and coffee, figure out the best people to be around the table, and really help make sure that these conversations are happening in a productive way. And we need to get away, frankly, in Canada from this idea that every province is its own little isolated electricity system, and they're not well integrated. There's very little coordinated, large region electricity planning. Like, we have to get out of this, parochial provincial approach to electricity planning in Canada. And so I think if the federal government can create something that just gets people at the table to have those conversations and kind of remove themselves from from the politics of electricity, I think that'll be a very helpful thing. But it's like all of this stuff, it's really going to depend on who participates and and the objectives that are set for the grid council.
And Ontario seems to be a bit of a case study here on the difficulty in managing, the herding of the electricity cats in Canada, because the Ford government has been signaling for a while now that as it takes some of its nuclear power plants out for offline for refurbishment, that it will be boosting its natural gas power production, which would then, critics have said, will significantly increase greenhouse gas emissions at a time when they should be dropping. And so what role is Ontario going to play in this, given the Ford government's attitude towards renewables and natural gas power plants?
Yeah, well, I think that should be a perfect example where a well-constructed conversation with other provinces will benefit Ontario down the road. Because really, what we need to be doing is having more electricity from Quebec coming into Ontario to fill the gap that the nuclear power refurbishments or phase outs are going to be causing. And again, because provincially we just have this very parochial approach to electricity, Ontario is just looking inside of Ontario. And if you look at most jurisdictions in the world, what they're doing in Australia, in Europe, in the UK, they have much larger regional planning bodies that figure out where are the resources, where is the demand, and how do we best design a system that's going to be low cost, reliable, and decarbonize. And really, this is why this is so important. And when you mentioned the doubling or tripling of the electricity system, if we do it really well, we'll probably have to double it. If we do it really poorly, we'll probably have to triple it. And so without this kind of longer term coordinated planning and thinking, we're not going to design a cost-effective electricity system. So I'm hoping that, if Ontario is sitting at the table with Quebec and the Maritimes, and maybe Manitoba, we can actually have some kind of bigger conversation about the best and most cost-effective way of building out this net zero electricity system.
Now, final question, Bruce. I've been watching the Americans as they go about modernizing their grid, and the Biden government in particular is putting in, tens of billions of dollars into various aspects of grid modernization. And the federal government here in Canada has put in an additional $600 million to support renewable electricity and grid modernization projects, another $250 million to support pre-development work for large clean electricity projects. And it seems, compared to what the Americans are doing, even if you take into account the power of 10, it still seems to be a drop in the bucket compared to what other jurisdictions are doing.
Yeah, and again, that gets a little bit at the the differences between the role of our federal government. So historically, the Department of Energy in the United States has played a much stronger role in electricity regulation and electricity financing and coordination. Federal government in Canada plays very little role, in reality. So that's part of it. So really, we've I think, realistically, we're going to have to rely on the provincial utilities to come to the table together with private capital. There'll be a little bit of federal money at the table, and probably parts of the country will rely more on federal money. But, Ontario and Quebec and the utilities that, for example, Hydro-Quebec and Hydro One and OPG, big organizations with, the capability to spend billions and billions of dollars, they're the ones that are going to be, having to pay for this stuff. But as I said, it's going to be better off for all Canadians if we look at this as a larger Canadian problem, as opposed to Ontario's doing this, Quebec's doing this, Alberta's doing this.
Well, Bruce, always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
Yeah, not at all. Thank you, Markham.